This will be my first episode in a series about Bob Dylan. Now, how do you talk about Bob Dylan? He's been doing this for 7 decades. So what I thought I would do is I thought I would look only at his studio albums and break them down by decade. So let's go back to 1960, where it all started, and let's drop the needle. As I said, I'm only going to be looking at the studio albums, and believe me, there are plenty of those. Now, there could be future episodes where we talk about his bootleg series, the official and the ones that weren't official. We could talk about his live albums. We could talk about his compilations. But again, that's a whole body of work. So now we're just going to focus on the studio albums that he released. And in this episode, those in the 1960s. As everybody probably knows, Bob Dylan was born up in Minnesota. Now, a fun fact, he attended the University of Minnesota, and he was actually in a fraternity there. But then he dropped out, and he moved to New York City. When he got to New York, he hitchhiked his way up to a hospital where he could visit one of his idols who was quite ill, and that was Woody Guthrie. He became friends with Woody. He played a lot of songs to Woody, and then he went back into Greenwich Village and started performing these songs all around the village. He got signed to Columbia Records by the very well-respected John Hammond, and he released his first album in 1962, which is simply called Bob Dylan, and it contains his covers of some standard folk songs, but there are 2 original Bob Dylan songs on the record. But the record didn't sell, and the critics just ripped it apart. But now it's considered a classic. You might have different favorite tracks on this album, but here are mine. With the folk standards, I like Man of Constant Sorrow, Pretty Peggy O, Baby Let Me Follow You Down, House of the Rising Sun, Freight Train Blues, and See That My Grave Is Kept Clean. Dylan's 2 originals are Talkin' New York and his song To Woody. In 1962, Bob makes his first trip to England. And as we'll see over the course of these episodes, the English people really took to Bob Dylan. On his first trip over there, he was asked to star in a British TV drama called Madhouse on Castle Street. In May of 1963, he releases his second album, which is called The Freewheeling Bob Dylan. And his songwriting really starts to shine. Of the 13 tracks, he wrote 11 of them. And there's a backstory about the cover, because on the cover, he and a girl are seen walking through the cold, wintry streets of New York. And that was his girlfriend at the time, Suze Rotolo. Tracks include the lead-off, The Incredible Blowing in the Wind. A short time later, Peter, Paul, and Mary recorded it, and it sold over 1 million copies for them. It certainly established Dylan as a gifted songwriter. Blowing in the Wind is followed by The Lovely Girl from the North Country. Then he takes on The War Machine with The Biting Masters of War. And then there's the amazing A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall. At almost 7 minutes, Dylan portrays an apocalyptic image of a hard rain. Side 2, the lead-off, is Don't Think Twice, It's All Right. Apparently a song Bob wrote when he and Suze Rotolo broke up. Next up is Oxford Town. In September of 1962, the University of Mississippi refused admittance to a veteran to attend their school. The veteran was James Meredith. The U.S. federal troops intervened, and Meredith was allowed to attend, and the school became integrated. Bob wrote this song quickly, and it was published just 2 months later. Then we get the Talking World War III Blues, which is a song apparently Bob made up in the studio. One of my favorites is Carina Carina, one of the songs that Bob didn't write. And I also like Honey, Just Allow Me One More Chance. After this album was released, Bob was recognized as a major star, and the Beatles even thought he was tremendous. All of a sudden, the press branded Bob Dylan the voice of the generation. This was a tag that Dylan hated, and he rallied against it for years. At the beginning of 1964, Bob Dylan releases his third album, The Times Are A-Changin'. And this is the first album where he's written all of the songs, and it's just Bob on the record playing guitar, harmonica, and singing. The lead-off song is the title, The Times They Are A-Changin'. It's followed by the Ballad of Hollis Brown. By this time, Joan Baez, a well-established star on the folk circuit, decided that she was really liking what Bob Dylan was doing, and so she started inviting him and introducing him to play at her concerts. And then they became lovers. The next song on the album is with God on Our Side, and it's just Bob on this record, but when he and Joan performed it, it was magical. I like One Too Many Mornings, Only a Pawn in Their Game, Boots of Spanish Leather, and The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll. The album hit 20 in the US and 4 in the UK. As I said, the UK loved Bob Dylan. As this album took off, Bob decided to take an extended road trip and travel across the United States. And as he sat in the car, he wrote many songs, including Chimes of Freedom and Mr. Tambourine Man, both which would be big hits for the Byrds. Now, while he was crossing the US, Bob listened to the radio in the car a lot. And this was right when the Beatles descended onto America. And you couldn't escape their music on the radio. And it was interesting how even in these early days, the Beatles and Bob Dylan were influencing each other. The Beatles listened to Dylan's albums, was really impressed with the way he wrote lyrics. And when Bob was riding across the country and on the radio came, I Want to Hold Your Hand, he had to pull over by the side of the road and listen to the record. He was so enthralled by what he was hearing from the lads from Liverpool. Bob then headed back to England, where he would write most of the songs which appeared on his next album, released in 1964, Another Side of Bob Dylan. Once again, it's just Bob playing on the record. The lead off is All I Really Want to Do, which became a hit for the Turtles, Spanish Harlem Incident, Chimes of Freedom, My Back Pages, which the Byrds both had a hit with, and two songs I love, I Don't Believe You, She Acts Like We Never Have Met, and Ballad in Plain D. It details his breakup with Susie Rotolo, and Dylan has said in retrospect he regrets writing it. The album ends with It Ain't Me, Babe, which was a hit for both the Turtles and Johnny Cash. But Bob Dylan was feeling trapped in being a folk singer. He really wanted to go electric. So for his next album, he does. Well, at least for half of it. The album is called Bringing It All Back Home. Released in March of 1965, the album starts with the incredible Subterranean Homesick Blues, Johnny's on the Pavement, thinking about the government, and The Pump Don't Work because the Vandals took the handle. Then we get the blistering Maggie's Farm, the great love song, Love Minus Zero No Limit. The side closes with Bob's 115th Dream, a long 6.5-minute story about the finding of America. I like the opening. It starts with Bob playing the song acoustically. He laughs, and then he starts again playing it electric. Then side 2 is all acoustic. We get 4 classic songs, Mr. Tambourine Man, Gates of Eden, It's All Right, Ma, I'm Only Bleeding, with great lines like Money Doesn't Talk, It Swears, and even the President of the United States sometimes must have to stand naked. And the closer, It's All Over Now, Baby Blue. It's a great record, and it reaches number 6 in the US charts. Shortly after the album was released, Dylan appears at the Newport Folk Festival, and he's joined by Mike Bloomfield on guitar and Al Cooper on organ. And he is going electric. But the crowd is not having it, and he's booed off the stage after only 3 songs. But for Dylan, there was no turning back, and in 1965, he releases an album called Highway 61 Revisited. Now, Highway 61 goes all the way from Canada through Duluth, Minnesota, where Dylan was born, and all the way down to New Orleans. And Bob says it's the main thoroughfare of the blues. The opening track of the album takes no prisoners. It smacks you right between the eyes at over 6 minutes long, and it's called Like a Rolling Stone. Then there's the great It Takes a Lot to Laugh, It Takes a Train to Cry. Ballad of a Thin Man with the great lyric, Something's happening here, but you don't know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones? On side 2, we find the title track, Highway 61 Revisited, just like Tom Thumb's Blues, and then the album closes with an 11-minute acoustic song called Desolation Row. Although a number of the critics were really confused by this record, it sold well. It was number 3 in the US and number 4 in the UK. And a lot of people refer to this as Bob's best album. But hang on, he's just getting started. Bob tours with a backing band called the Hawks, and he is going all electric. So on tour, they're met with very mixed reactions, and in some cases, they are booed repeatedly. Bob decides to record his next album in New York, like he always does, but it's not working out. So he decides to go down to Nashville. And while he's there, he ends up creating one of rock's first double albums called Blonde on Blonde, which many people now say is Bob's best record. The album is unique in many ways, not the least of which it contains 2 hit singles from Bob Dylan. The lead-off is one of those hits, Rainy Day Women 12 and 35. I also like Visions of Joanna, One of Us Must Know Sooner or Later. Then comes the second hit, I Want You. We also have Stuck Inside a Mobile with the Memphis Blues again, the great Just Like a Woman, absolutely Sweet Marie, and the entire fourth side of the album is the terrific Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands. Buoyed by the success of the 2 singles, the album hits number 9 in the US and number 3 in the UK. With the success in England, Bob and the Hawks decide to tour the UK. And the way the tour is set up, Bob comes out and does his acoustic set. Then he's joined by the Hawks for the electric set. Well, many people in the UK did not like the electric set. And in fact, there's a very famous recording where when he starts to play electric, a member of the audience yells out to Dylan and calls him Judas. And Bob stops and says, I don't believe you, you're a liar, and turns around to Robbie Robinson of the Hawks, who became the band, and said, play the next one really effing loud. And they tore into Like a Rolling Stone. If you want to learn more about this tour, there's a great movie that D.A. Pennebaker put out, which is called Don't Look Back. And even if you only watch the first part of it, which is Bob doing Subterranean Homesick Blues, it's a great movie. But you should watch the whole thing because it really tells you a lot about Dylan at this time on his European tour. Then on July 29, 1966, the world learns that Bob Dylan is involved in a serious accident, a motorcycle accident up in Woodstock, New York. Now, the details are really kind of murky about this, and nobody really knows what happened, but it did allow Bob to withdraw from the public eye. Now, since his backing band, the Hawks, had also moved up to the Woodstock area, in 1967, when Bob was feeling a little better, he decided to go over to a house they rented called Big Pink and record some demos in the basement. Now, these became the basement tapes, and they were famous for a long time because it took a long time for them to get released. In fact, the basement tapes didn't really come out until 1975. Later in 1967, Bob decides to go down to Nashville to record his next album, which is called John Wesley Harding. This album is startling because it was released right in the throes of psychedelia. You've got the Beatles having recorded Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. You got the Stones doing their Satanic Majesty's Request, but Bob's not having any of that. This is a folk and country infused album, and it is totally different than anything else that was coming out in 1967. All the songs are short, and there are gems here, like As I Went Out One Morning, I Dreamed I Saw St. Augustine, All Along the Watchtower, which Jimi Hendrix would rework and eventually own as his own, Dear Landlord, I Pity the Poor Immigrant, Down Along the Cove, and the closer, I'll Be Your Baby Tonight. The album was a hit, reaching 2 in the US and going to number 1 in the UK. Bob so enjoyed recording in Nashville that he stays there to record his next album, which is his pure country album. It's called Nashville Skyline. And look, there he is on the cover smiling at you. That's weird. And also, Bob was never known for his singing voice, but on this album, he actually croons. A little known fact is that Johnny Cash wanted to produce this album, but that didn't really happen. But he and Bob became very close friends. So close, in fact, that the lead-off song, A Girl from the North Country, is a duet of Johnny Cash with Bob Dylan. Then we get I Threw It All Away, the great Lay Lady Lay, and Tonight I'll Be Staying Here With You. Unlike the harsh reaction that Dylan got when he decided to go electric, there was no backlash when he went country, and Nashville Skyline went to number 3 in the US and number 1 in the UK. Dylan closed out the 1960s by appearing on Johnny Cash's TV show and headlining the Isle of Wight Festival, but not the Woodstock Festival, which he was asked to appear at and would have been much closer to his home. Now, as usual, I've created a Spotify playlist that contains some of the songs from this episode, and here's the link, and I'll put it in the comments below as well, so you can relive some of these great Dylan songs. Between 1962 and 1969, Bob Dylan released 9 studio albums. He started out as a simple folk singer. Then he became a protest singer, the voice of a generation. Then he became an all-out electric rocker. And then he morphed into a country singer. How does it feel? In future episodes, we'll look at Bob Dylan's studio albums in the 70s, and in the 80s, and in the 90s, all the way up to current date. Thanks for watching, and as always, keep a rock.
If you liked this episode, hit the like button, and you can also leave me a comment down below, and I'll respond to you. If you subscribe, we'll let you know when future episodes come out.